Hello and welcome to episode 1 of season 3 of the CDW Canada podcast. I'm your host, KJ Burke. This year we're going to be changing the podcast slightly and focusing more on a tech talk track. And for episode 1, we're going to be covering the way that IT has changed how it invests in computing and the rise of FinOps. And I'm here with Mihir Shah, our VP and CFO at CDW Canada. He's going to break down all things finances for us. Welcome to the podcast, Mihir.
Thank you, KJ. It's wonderful to be here with you today.
So maybe we could start with a bit of an introduction, and you could tell us a little bit about yourself and sort of your background in finance.
Sure. So I graduated from university and knew what I always wanted to do was be in finance. It's loved numbers and loved playing around with things and trying to solve problems through numbers. So I started my career at an accounting firm and then moved to IBM shortly thereafter, where I was there for about 20 years, just under 20 years. In multiple roles, capacities within IBM, all in Canada. And it was a wonderful experience for me where I got to see multiple different facets of finance, whether that's budgeting and planning, deal management, as well as core accounting. And then, realized, that I was up for a new challenge, and that's how I ended up at CDW a couple of years ago now. Can't believe it's been a couple of years already. It's gone really quick. But as the CFO and Vice President as well in Canada, and it's been a wonderful experience thus far, leading the entire finance organization here in Canada.
Yeah, it's definitely been good, talking to you and working with your team. I think it's brought a different level to kind of how we're looking at finance within the organization. And it's interesting, you have that long tenure with finance. I've benefited from a bunch of different mentors within IT that had really good approaches around finance. So, coming through Burke and the background I have there, it was really that we were always focused on a business case. And part of our challenge was that IT was always viewed as a cost center. And so we weren't part of the value generation necessarily of the mining company, even though IT was everywhere and it was needed in the process. And so, whether it was, Danny or Gord or Steve or Hans or David, I had some really good mentors that we always had to have a solid business case. We always had to have the numbers in line, and we had to really build that up. So I've definitely benefited from the type of mentorship that somebody like you brings to the table.
That's great.
So I want to talk a little bit about the economy, because I think the economy is still sort of top of mind. And one of the things that you mentioned, early in the pandemic that we talked about a little bit at the beginning of this year, was that you felt that there was going to be fluctuations, but they weren't going to be overall fluctuations. There's going to be sort of an ebb and a flow. And so maybe you just give me a bit of your sort of perspective on, where we're at and what we're looking for as we go forward.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's a great question and an interesting perspective, because I think we've been, at least for the last number of years now, within the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, financial stuff has been very, very hard, right, to predict, because there's been so many shocks to the system going in and then coming out. And then kind of where we are right now, I think is a bit of an odd place. And I'm far from an economist by any stretch of the imagination, so I'm certainly not the governor of the Bank of Canada and a great prognosticator, but I think where we are right now, like just looking at the macro trends and what you read in the news, and I think I feel the same things many of us feel. Inflation has really, really triggered us in the last number of months now, probably for the better part of a year, but that seems to be tapering down and normalizing out. Interest rates phenomenons have really spiked. And then now are probably trailing down. But it's important to note, still at fairly historic averages, right? I know we had very low interest rates for quite a while, near zero essentially, and now we're back to a 5% and 6% kind of Bank of Canada, which is a more traditional rate. I mean, if you look back at the 1980 as an example, we were at 21%. So just some historical context. It feels like a shock because we were essentially for 20 years in a zero interest rate environment or a very low interest rate. So it feels very shocking. And I think for people's home finances, it absolutely is.
Yeah.
But also for business finance, that's a challenge. I think the other thing coming out of the pandemic and going into the pandemic is really about access to talent, right, in labor. And I think everybody on record would tell you 2022 was the big, the great resignation and all that. And I think certainly CDW and lots of companies felt didn't know where people were coming or going, and it became really difficult to figure out who was going to do the work and what skills you had to go and invest in. So I think those are now easing in terms of the labor challenges. I think there's still probably pockets of challenge, but in general, the labor market, I think, has tapered down into something a little bit more manageable by people. The attrition rates aren't just all over the place. So I think we're probably in a more stable environment now, but not quite there, right, would be kind of where I'm thinking right now.
Yeah, that's a good point, and really, I think you're right. I think we've had some really good talent that left, and we had really good talent that then came back.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think there was definitely a bit of uncertainty around how we're going to do that. I still think specifically around cybersecurity, we have a huge skills gap there. There just
Correct.
aren't enough people. And,
Yep.
I talked to some of the local universities, and they just can't train people fast enough to get them into the workforce. So, no, that's a good point there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things though is we do feel positive. I mean, the great thing about the industry you and I are in is it's IT and it's tech, and so one of the things you started mentioning was you've had great mentors in finance, and that's great to see and hear. The reality of it is, I think even as finance professionals, we have now come to terms with the reality that IT is a strategic driver and actually a key investment vehicle for businesses to transform. And it comes in many different flavors, right? And so the good news about where we are in IT is, even if the economy is kind of flattish or growing, IT spend, in my opinion, will always take a lion's share above what's actually happening in the general and the broader market, just because clients or businesses have to constantly digitally reinvest and reintegrate different pieces of their business, right? So it's a great place to be in IT, because I do think there's an overweight amount of money. Whatever money there is, there's an overweight amount of money going into IT. Right.
No, I think you point out something interesting, and this is something that when I talk to IDC and Gartner and some of the analysts that look at the industry, one of the keys there is that more organizations are trying to deliver value in a digital manner. And one of the powerful parts of that is as you point out, speed of delivery. And I think for a lot of organizations, what that helps is it moves those IT resources from being an overhead, being a cost center, to being more part of the value of the organization. So if we look at that state of finance, we look at kind of what the economy is doing, and actually no forward statements, nothing being done here. But when we look at that, I think you make a good point around how that's going to, organizations are still going to continue to invest in IT because there are these digital transformation projects. They are trying to deliver digitally. How does that impact an organization's decision making? Obviously, an organization has a limited amount of capital available. They have a limited amount of debt that they want to carry on the books. How does our current state sort of influence, you as a decision maker, when we're trying to look at, well, where do we focus our dollars and where do we focus our spend?
And I think that's been the hardest part actually for finance is to figure out where we're going, right? In order to be strategic thinkers, we try to anchor on what do we know, right? And do we know the revenue, the top line is going to grow, the cost drivers are going to do this, that, and the other thing. I think there's been a lot of shocks to the system, and that's been really difficult to navigate financially, to release budget, to build budget, and make sure it's affordable from a shareholder perspective, at least in public company example, or even from a small, medium enterprise, right? From how does somebody or the owner of that business take home profit for their own families? And that's been really difficult, right? Because you've had everybody essentially go from an in-office. Now, obviously, that's not entirely true, right? Because there's manufacturing and other type of industries which never really left an office and went remote, right? But there's broad sectors of the economy that have done that. Labor has become a different challenge in finding and accessing the labor, and then figuring out what the profile of the company actually is in terms of how much the revenue will come in. And remember, the amount of investment you can make is really tied down to what you think your sales or your revenue is going to be, right? I mean, that's an anchor, right? So, and then that's how we plan. And if we don't have certainty around that, that becomes really difficult for that. Other complicating things are really things around some of the supply chain shocks, right, which have happened, especially in our industry,
Yeah.
but all across, right, whether that's buying a car, whether that's buying IT gear, everything has been very challenged. And so how do you access that? And so you could plan, okay, we're going to go buy X number of these things on this month. And then the vendor or the OEM tells you, well, fortunately, you can't get it this month and it's 6 months later and you don't know that, right? And so that's been really difficult for finance to really play in and really guide and strategize with the business on how to plan for the future and how to release budget, finding and accessing talent, who's coming and who's going. I think that was the hardest thing I dealt with in 2022 was I don't even know what our headcount profile looks like, right? Because, every month it was up and down so much, right? It became really, really difficult as a challenge to plan and then help the business guide it through achieving its earnings expectations and those types of things.
That's an interesting point you make there, because I hadn't thought about how, I guess from a finance perspective, you want consistency. You want to be able to project and all of those, whether it's a change in people or whether it's a change in direction, impacts you and what you're doing
For
immediately.
Sure.
That's interesting.
Well, the other thing, like if you just look at business climate, right? Like businesses in general just want consistency. So look, if interest rates are going to be 5%, go from 0 to 5, but then stay at 5% for the next 5 years, we just need to know that. Then we can plan, right? But if we have an interest rate environment or a labor environment or a supply chain environment, and all those things are moving up and down significantly, it becomes really difficult to plan, right? And then really figure out, how much money do we have? How much can we afford? How much budget do we have for these things? How much capital we have? Like all those things become very, very challenging for a finance organization who's generally part of a decision-making process to really add value, right? It was really difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think being an IT professional and working within IT and the business cases and trying to convince the business through those business cases to invest.
Right.
Again, having that consistency and being able to really predict, what is the ultimate value, what's the return on that investment. If you can't do that, a lot of times you just couldn't secure the funding to do the project. So it's interesting knowing that, as an IT professional, we're dealing with this state that's fluxing, but also you're also dealing with the state that's constantly in flux the last couple of years as well.
And for us, we want to support the business. I think, so some of the comments you made are really on point, actually, right? Like we as a finance organization have made IT a cost center, just like we're paying rent at our office. And the reality of it is IT is no longer just the cost center. It is a driver and enabler of business, right? It's a requirement, right? And so unfortunately, I think the old school finance way of thinking is, well, just put it as a discernible widget or a unit of cost as opposed to a strategic driver of value, right? So we as a finance function also have to change our way of thinking and adapt in order to drive business outcomes because we're trying to be more strategic as well.
Yeah, and so I think we're talking a lot about spend, and I think that's key because, again, as professionals, if we can't get investment, we can't drive change, and we can't be that value generation team that I think IT needs to be. So let's talk a little bit about the different ways that organizations spend. And so let's talk a little bit about CAPEX and OPEX. And from my perspective, coming from a mining background, we were very heavily CAPEX. And so we were generally, on the smaller side of the CAPEX budget, primarily because, buying, $2.5 million trucks one at a time or a dozen at a time, drove that capital budget. But looking at, some organizations are still sticking with CAPEX. Some organizations are spending, and really tracking in an OPEX way. Why do organizations tend to prefer OPEX over CAPEX? And maybe how does some of that decision making come into place?
Yeah, and this is just my opinion, so I'll give it. But just if I could come back just a bit, let's define CAPEX and OPEX. So in case anybody in the audience or anybody listening or watching, they kind of have a general idea. So CAPEX is capital expenditure. And what that really generally we're looking at are things that we're acquiring that have value beyond the current period in mind. So typically we're looking at machinery, automobiles, IT gear, those things that when we're acquiring them, they have a useful life greater than kind of 12 months. That's typically what we would call CAPEX in a consumer world. Like if you're buying a car, it doesn't just You're not buying it for the day. You're buying it for probably 7 to 10 years. And what we do in accounting or in finance, as we acquire those things, we put it on our balance sheet, and we depreciate that cost over what we call the useful life. So if it's a car, as an example, we bought a $50,000 car. We know the life of that car is 10 years. We depreciate $5,000 a year into the income statement as depreciation every year.
Okay.
On the flip side, OPEX or operating expenses typically were reserved for things that have value only at that point in time, and it doesn't have residual value afterward, and therefore hits the income statement immediately. And so think about rent and utilities and things like that. Like once you use it, there's no future value of that thing that you just spent. And so just wanted to make sure we had a bit of an understanding of what those things are. And then IT, of course, goes and makes it very, very complicated because there's there's different hybrids of those models, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute. But to answer your question, just coming back to that, what's driving why CapEx versus OPEX, I really think comes down to management incentive and also industry specific things, right? Which probably are generated out of management bias, right? So you mentioned you're at Burke, and that's a capital intensive thing, a capital intensive business, I should say. And that primarily comes down to how they, I think, in my opinion, how they raise capital. And they're constantly doing big raises, either share sales or going in and doing bought deals and things of that nature. So their access to large sums of money at one point in time, i.e. will go raise $250 million, gives them a large pool of dollars to then go and spend. Other companies may not have that, where at least in today's economy, let's say, for an example, you're a software company selling things on the internet, direct to consumer, direct to business. Your revenue flows tend to be periodic in nature, so every month, every 6 months. So you don't have large influxes of cash to go and just spend $2 million on a piece of equipment. So what you're trying to do essentially is space out your expenditures to be more of an operating type thing, which is more matching to what your revenue or your cash flow looks like. Right. There's other theories around it in terms of certain industries are measured on a return of invested capital and those kinds of metrics. And so those industries could lever one way or the other depending on how those specific metrics kind of go. As an example, in software companies, that's always looking at annual recurring revenue or those types of things are the metrics that are important in those industries, and therefore they're looking that's why that drives management behavior accordingly, right? And that's why there's a bias one way or the other.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't. I think I understood some of that. No, not some of it. Sorry. Let me back up.
Maybe I should explain it again.
So I think I organically understood that just with how I've worked with the business previously. Right. But your breakdown, I think I learned something there really regarding the way that organizations are tying their spend to the income and the expectations there. That's really interesting. And yeah, I mean, where we're really focusing from a capital perspective is, again, heavy industry and oil and gas, and then also like with research and education, where they have these large grants and things like that. So, well, it's interesting. So, the other thing maybe we can help the listener sort of better understand is how do we, how does IT really communicate better with finance to help secure that funding? So if maybe we've got a hybrid model where maybe we do have some cash on hand and we're going to spend that on things like hardware, but we also have the need to tie our projects to more of an operational expense. So how does IT need to better communicate with the finance team so they can better understand how to make this happen?
Yeah, so I think on that's been the biggest challenge, because I think even finance hasn't been clear about what it requires. And I think the IT environment has changed significantly in terms of pricing models, contracting models, the way companies have traditionally operated in IT. And I think long gone are the days where it's a black and white scenario. And trust me, finance loves a black and white scenario, right? Where it's either we purchase it or we rent it. And there's only those two scenarios. The reality of it is you can do those scenarios, but there's many different options in between those bookends, right? And that has become really complicated. But if we just break it down, this is basic business decision making, is what I would say, which is What would you need? Look, get in early, right? So don't, come in, oh my God, the renewal's happening 2 days from now, I need to do something. That becomes really difficult. That's the obvious one. But then other than that, it's basic business decision making, looking at total cost of ownership over a period of time, right? So not just, it's just $12, it's just $1,000 a month. Well, no, it's not just $1,000 a month. It's, do we have the right labor to go and staff and deploy that thing,
Yeah.
or manage that life cycle of that deployment over many months and years? Is there a maintenance stream that happens as you acquire something, as an example? So looking at a total cost of ownership, do we have to house that thing in a particular facility? Do we have access to that facility? What are the costs of that facility? So looking at a total cost of ownership really helps. And then of course that's the cost equation, and we talked a lot about finance trying to use IT or trying to look at IT not as a cost center. So I'm going to move really quickly to the value equation or the value creation, which is, what are we going to get from acquiring that? So we got to quickly move into the value creation piece of it. And what are the values we're going to drive? Whether that's increased market share or revenue, whether that's cost removal or cost takeout, whether that's going to be cost avoidance, right? It could be any one of those things. And there could be intangible ones, right? In terms of like, it's going to make us brand better. It's going to give us the ability to market a full stack solution of and therefore we can go to the market with a full product suite, right? So those things are all always important as well, right? But I think oftentimes what happens is it comes to us as a cost thing, and then we're trying to extract what are the value creation elements. The other thing I'll say is a couple, just maybe a couple things if I could dovetail off that. We get a lot of projects, and I think you could probably generate 100, 200, 300 projects in a year, right? The reality of it is, I think there's got to be a recognition of we have limited funds. Every household, every business has a limited set of funds, and that's just the reality of what it is, and therefore every project may have a business case that is positive, but because of financial constraints or just investment constraints, not every project, just because it's positive, will have access to capital or access to dollars to get it done. And so what I always say is, it doesn't matter if the case is positive or negative. It's a matter of relativity around that, right? And so we look at different metrics, what we call net present value, internal rate of return, but as a way of guiding us into, hey, we've got 100 different investment ideas. We can't afford 100 different things, at least this year. How do we then go and apply logic and stream those things through a path to then pick the best ones out of them? And again, it's not just a financial thing. Some of it could be a branding thing. Some of it could be intangible things will carry the day, right? Like, we have to train our people. In order to do that, we have to invest in a platform to help us deliver training. It may not have a hard intangible rate of return on it, but some of those things we will prioritize based on what the business dynamic is. So I think, from an IT perspective, sharing that, looking at total cost of ownership, looking at some of the metrics around internal rate of return and net present value, or even some of the intangible things, of course, those matter too. Giving us a full picture of that really helps.
Yeah, I think that's a good point there. A couple of things there just I sort of pulled out was, first of all, dig below the surface a little bit. So don't stay with just, well, this is the bill of materials to do the project. Really dig into, well, what is it going to cost us over the long term? So I do think that that's key. And one of the things I've done as an IT professional is I've always included cost as one of the measurable metrics when I'm looking at like different technology. So when I'm trying to compare technology A versus B versus C, I look at cost as a measurable part of the decision,
For sure.
not as like a yes or no decision at the end where we just chose the cheapest thing. And so I think that's a key. The other thing to tie back to sort of, what is the focus of the organization at that point in time? If the organization is focused on growth, then let's focus on projects that drive the top line. And then if the organization is focused on optimization, well, then let's drive projects that really, digitally transform and maybe optimize how we do things. And so I think, to what you're saying, better understanding what the organization is trying to accomplish, and then aligning your projects with a better total cost of ownership analysis will drive a lot of success.
Yeah, and that's really good. I mean, that's a great way of saying it, KJ. I never really thought about it that way, but you're right in the sense, at a point in time, what is important to the business may be different today than it was a year ago. And as an example, last year, and you would have seen this at CDW in Canada, you couldn't find people last year, so everything was all about business transformation, and the projects that we were looking at was all about how can we digitize and how can we reduce our reliance on people. Not because we don't like people, but because we just couldn't find the people at the right times, right? And so we just, the business need was to digitize and reduce the dependence on people, because you just couldn't find them, right? Now you're coming through that a little bit, and so the transformation is a bit different this year. It's probably around top line protection and how we go gain market share, and so the business shifts, and that's a great way of doing that. So thank you for that. That was really helpful, actually. I really hadn't internalized it the way you said it, right? So that was very good. Thank you.
Just make sure my boss knows.
Yeah, well, they're probably going to watch. So,
so as we're talking about operational expenses, and I think that one of the things that has really helped IT sort of become part of that value stream is the way that organizations are spending within the public cloud. And I know we were talking about public cloud and kind of what the footprint is there, but in building within the public cloud, a lot of times our spend is really driven towards a per project, per application, which to what you're talking about is great from a total cost of ownership, which is great from ideating what the value is, because when we're able to tie the costs and the ultimate benefit into sort of one package on a per application or per project basis, I think that becomes very, very powerful. So how has the investment in the public cloud, whether it's infrastructure as a service or as a service, SaaS applications, how has that changed the way that finance really looks at funding IT projects?
Yeah, that's been one of the biggest dynamic changes that's happened in finance, especially for somebody like me who's been in IT for 20 years within finance, right? And so to watch that transform. It's really driven complexity, I think, for finance, but I think has been positive overall for the entire business. And so I like the way you use the word public cloud, because I don't really think about it as public cloud. I think it as a buying vehicle and how we're acquiring a product or a service, right? So like back to my bookends that I mentioned earlier, where it was a black and white, right? It's like either we're going to buy the whole honking thing, or we're going to go and pay for it or rent it every month or every week or whatever that is on a sort of consumption type basis. And the reality of it is those two things exist, but hundreds of different options or scenarios exist between those things. For example, you can go and commit to a piece of software as a rental. You can go commit to a piece of software as a 5-year committed, which would be cheaper than a straight rental. And then that morphs all the way backward into, I'm just going to go buy it as a one-time purchase type model. And that would probably be, in theory, the cheapest. Having said that, some product is not even available as a one-time purchase anymore, right? So businesses have evolved. And I really think, by the way, that is technology driven, like the ability to use data, build tooling to control billing and pricing functions, control all the back-end functions in terms of interoperability, turn on, turn off service, and then navigate the internal supply chain of deliver that service or the availability of that product or service to the end client has really morphed the ability to have multiple different business models. But that has really complicated the way we plan. But at the same time, I believe it has democratized the way spending actually occurs, at least in the larger enterprise, maybe not so much in small and medium enterprise. In kind of the medium to larger enterprise, there was always that centralized CIO function, all the spend routed through that CIO function. And historically, the CIO function, along with the vendor management or procurement function, would control the spend profile of those various things and manage partner or vendor relationships. Now, in the new world, the IT owner specifically is going out to the market and contracting directly with vendors about a particular product and not routing it necessarily to the CIO office. So marketing organization needs to go buy a piece of marketing subscription. Typically that would route through the CIO budget. marketing would have to go ask the CIO. The CIO would say yes or no, and it would funnel through a normal business intake process of approval of funds. Now the marketing folks says, hey, finance, just give me a budget and I'm going to stay within it, whether that's people, technology, or anything. And they spend within that. And what you have is now democratization of that spend. So that marketing or finance or HR or some of the functions, at least in larger enterprise, theoretically drive that spend on their own. The reality, though, from a finance and business planning standpoint is where you could typically go to the CIO, control the spend there and manage the spend there.
Yeah.
Now that spend is happening all across the continuum. And so that's not a bad thing. It's just how you manage that now is transforming, right? Because you can't just go to the CIO and give the CIO an IT budget and expect all IT will root through there because now IT has democratized spending throughout.
Yeah, and so, but an interesting part of that, though, I think, is that if we are spending on a month-to-month basis and we're spending just what we're consuming, then from a financial perspective, maybe it reduces the amount of risk to the organization because if they have to turn off the tap, they can just turn off the tap.
Yeah. So there's some. So again, I think this comes back to what is the thing we are committing to, and are we really savvy to what we're committing to? And so you're right. If it's a pure rental model where you can turn it off and turn it on, that's great. But more often than not, there's very little. I mean, there's not as many just pure rental options. These are 3 and 5 year commit type options now with a minimum commit, and then any overage. You pay a per click or a per MIP or a per terabyte type usage model. Do those functions actually understand the contract they're just about to sign and commit to?
Yeah.
And so, yes, you're right. It could be a monthly usage model, but if it's a monthly commit, and then what happens in year 2 if we change our mind and then we realize, oh my gosh, now it's too late. The other thing I will say though is from a optimization of deploying of capital. This is the classic. Do I buy the car or do I take Ubers everywhere, right? And so, inevitably, you're paying. Do you want flexibility or do you want kind of cost optimization, right? And typically, if you buy the car in the long run over a 10-year period of time, that's going to be cheaper than taking an Uber everywhere. If you're a reasonable driver driving 20,000 kilometers a year. But this is this bridge of cost versus flexibility, right? And this is this battle I think everybody faces every day, not only in business but at home, right? And so we may make decisions where it ties and you have flexibility, but at the end of it, if you look at the 5-year cost of ownership on a rental model, it probably would have been cheaper to buy it up front, and we would have found the capital, routed through an intake process. We would have saved money as a business over 5 years than just renting for 5 years, right? And so those are the things like, finance can help guide that business decision making when we're consulted, and that I think is part of the issue, point. Right? And so if we're not consulted, and the democratization, which I think is good, right? But if we're not brought in and looking at that, then we're missing that ability to optimize capital deployment and optimize cost efficiency as well.
Yeah, and I think that sort of speaks to, I think one of the takeaways that I wanted to get out of this is I think that, if we have an opportunity to help, our IT peers really understand a better way to communicate with finance and a better way to sort of drive those conversations and make sure that they're consulting finance when they need to help make those decisions effectively. So we're talking about, costs. You talked a little bit about sort of consistent costs, but then overages. One of the things that I think a lot of IT professionals are looking at right now is this new term FinOps, and how do we start to get financial visibility in real time, because more and more organizations have been bitten by, well, the overages weren't that much initially, but then we decided to run another sort of AI machine learning model in the public cloud, and all of a sudden our costs went through the roof. So in your mind, kind of what is FinOps, and how does that again help provide real-time visibility and maybe change our decision making on the fly?
Yeah, and so FinOps, you're right to point out, it's a relatively new concept. I don't know when it actually started as a thing, but in my mind, I link it back to the growth of CRM platforms, where it's more about integrated business planning or trying to integrate business planning, whether that's people planning in terms of who's coming on and off, but also linking what your sales profile or your sales funnel looks like in terms, and then tying that into your supply chain, say more in a manufacturing type environment, and then linking that back to wherever your manufacturing sites are, and then programming that to be your just-in-time delivery system. Like a lot of that is FinOps. It could also be, in CDW, our example would be really tied to how does the evolution of a transaction actually flow through the various pieces of the various tool sets we have, whether that's sales and order intake to order fulfillment to the invoicing cycle to the collection cycle, and that whole thing. How does that, and then what's the return cycle, and how does that all work, and all the crediting, and so all of those things is the linkage of a financial tool set that has linkages into like a messaging bus that basically goes to all various componentries of the business, right? And helps you business plan. So it's a relatively new term, probably geared, oddly enough, back to IT or growth and technological development or data availability that has driven this need to look at a business holistically. And that has really changed and probably driven visibility, but complexity, right? Because now you're really looking at data-driven solutions or data-driven ideas to help you navigate, oh, this is my order flow and this is my sales funnel. These are the types of things that are moving, these ones aren't. And then how am I going to adjust my resourcing, whether that's people or supply chain, accordingly? And then how am I going to communicate that to my vendors? So that has really become an interesting challenge in the last, I'd say, 25 years, 30 years, but even more so now with digitalization and digitization of all sorts of different processes.
Yeah.
I think what's been challenging, in that regard is there's no real true integrated solution. It works on day one when you form your company. 5 years out, that no longer works because now you're into like, oh, the business climate has changed, and now I've had to adapt my business model. You go and acquire this other piece of software to go do this other piece of problem that now is manifested that you didn't know about. And so if you look at legacy businesses, and I mean legacy not as like 100-year-old business, even at 15 or 20-year-old business, they're grappling with the ability to really see from the sale all the way to a delivery and the collection. They're really seeing a challenge on seeing that entire view. That has become a real challenge. But it's been really cool as a finance organization because that is all what we love, which is data-driven analysis, data-driven insights, and then helping use that data to plan and help make business decisions.
Yeah, so part of that I think comes down to visibility, and as you point out, like end-to-end visibility is almost impossible to put together, especially when you have those existing applications and bringing that together. So because I would be remiss if I did not invoke the term AI, because AI is I think if you listen to the hype, AI is changing everything every minute of every day, but realistically. You mentioned being able to react to some of those market forces, to be able to react to some of that data, or maybe react to a situation that we haven't dealt with before. Right. And so when we look at artificial intelligence from a finance perspective, how do we see that changing maybe the way that organizations invest or the way that IT secures funding, all the things we've been talking about?
Yeah, and I think that, again, that's a new, and I'm glad you raised it because it's coming, and it's not even coming, it's actually here. And there's a lot of talk around it, and it'll take a few years, I think, for it to really impact everything. But we're starting to see it now. I mean, Microsoft has announced, an entire platform, right? And it's coming out through everybody's, every vendor. And I just mentioned one, right? I mean, every one of them has an AI capability, or now it's generative AI, right? So it is coming. I think that is no different than, what I would say is the IT shocks that have happened, going back to Y2K, right? And like that whole thing, right? And then all that build up for that. And then there was the whole CRM push, and then even point of I shouldn't say point of solution. I was going to say point of solution, but specific solutions around like how do I manage procurement and how do I manage HR and how do I, all those types of solutions. This is just yet another one that probably is more of a platform that touches all those things that I just mentioned because you can infuse it into CRM and you can infuse it in your HR management tooling and you can infuse it in your various back-end systems. And I think that has the ability, like AI or generative AI has the ability absolutely to transform the way many things happen. Having said that, it's going to provide insight. I'm not really sure it's going to take the complete human element out of
Yeah.
every single piece of transaction, because I have a very hard time to believe the same way CRM didn't just automatically reduce the amount of people you needed. In fact, it probably just changed the type of people you needed as opposed to just eliminate the need for people, right? Like this thought that you're not going to need people in companies and AI is just going to go do everything. I mean, I don't think anybody subscribes to that unless you do, but it could pick apart certain specific functions and then that function will be a little bit more AI driven or data driven. And then you take those resources, then you put them to higher value problems that can't be really solution through that. And through that, because let's face it, there's always going to be high value problems that a computer can't solve. We've been dealing with that since the generation of a computer, whatever numbers, decades ago, right? So we're just humans are moving up the value chain and changing their lens on the value chain. That's all that's going to happen. But in terms of business planning, I think my concern is we get drawn into the sexy, right? Which is like, oh, it's a big term, and like, and there is a need to invest in that and be strategic about that. But there's also a point to be practical about that too, and not overcommit too early to those principles. Just because I have this software and now it's got an AI generation, I think we've got to come back to business basics, which is back to what we talked about. What are the value creation elements?
Yeah.
What are we trying to solve? What are the insights we're trying to gain? What is the problem of the year? So it was in a corporation, whether that's business transformation we talked about, or whether that's sales solidification or revenue solidification. What is it doing for us, or is it cost takeout? What are we actually trying to achieve? And does that really work? Is it proven? Is it tested?
Absolutely. And like when I look at AI, I think AI is really going to give us insights that we didn't have before.
Correct.
It's going to provide us a visibility or maybe a way of analyzing the data that maybe we hadn't thought about. But you're right. Like I don't think organizations are just going to turn over their investment decision making and what applications do they build, how do they proceed forward, to AI to make the decision. So the other thing I think you touched on is really important is not as a tool to replace, but as a tool to augment. And one of the conversations I have with a lot of customers I deal with is, your IT people, your people at your organization, they're your subject matter experts on your organization. And so they know it better than anybody else does. And so when I look around at my peers at CDW Canada, they're experts, whether it's in finance or part of your team, whether they're part of our contracts team, our renewals team, but they are experts on the way that we as an organization work. Right. And so giving them additional data so they can make better decisions, or giving them insights so that they can maybe plan a little bit better is great.
Yeah.
But you're not going to take away from the fact that they are experts on the organization and what our values are and all of those things.
Well, look, any technology is great until it, but point is it just doesn't sit on a shelf. It has to actually integrate into business process or the business itself, right? So there is an element of, I don't know, customization or implementation that, it doesn't work off the shelf, right? Generally, gone are the days where you just, I don't know, bought Microsoft Office, put the CD in your thing and loaded it, and you just went out. Like, that's not what we're talking about, generally speaking, right? We're talking about, detailed business processes that have not only just a IT flow, but also have a business process flow with rules. And AI or general AI has to be able to adapt into that. And I don't really think it will. It may create new rules, but I don't think it's going to take away the rules, right, about that.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So, the last thing I like to do on the podcast is to kind of talk about, predictions or what's exciting about the future. And so, when I look at, some of the topics we've been talking about, one of the things I'm excited for is that I I think organizations are going to be able to continue to take risks at a smaller level. I think they're going to be able to continue to invest in smaller applications or smaller changes, and limit the amount of risk to the business by having finite contracts in place, and being able to really focus that, but focus it for a period of time. And one of the things we talk about fairly regularly is learning quickly. Some organizations say fail fast. One of the guys I talked to last year on the podcast said learn quickly, and I like that. In that, we're gonna go down the road. We're gonna try to validate. We're gonna try and build the value you talked about, and then we're gonna make a decision. Are we seeing the value that we predicted we would see? And we're gonna do that quickly, effectively. We're gonna have some financial visibility into that so that we can really judge it and look at, are we gonna receive the value that we thought? Is our TCO analysis that we did actually correct?
Bearing out, yeah.
So that's one of the things I think is exciting there. When you look at sort of future state, and you look at what's exciting you about where we're going with all these various technologies, what's kind of exciting you?
Yeah, and I think we talked about AI, and I think that is the key one, I think, at this juncture. But I think a lot of the quote unquote old, and I don't think they're really old, right? We're talking maybe half a decade, like 5 years, digital reinvention. I still think if you go and look at core processes within businesses, it's still a lot of it still is email based or paper based, right? Like it's still that. So this whole digital reinvention, that entire platform will continue to play. And then really the whole FinOps of getting visibility of the transaction from start to finish of that transaction will continue to play. And that is the entire the entire point of digital reinvention, to call and look at some of those things. So a lot of those things really continue to excite me in terms of a market space within. If you look at 2024 or even 2025, those things will still continue to play. I'm sure we could dig up a study, and I probably should have done some homework on, how many processes in IT companies are still not digitally reinvented. I'm going to guess it's still 80% of it.
Yeah.
Funny story, post-pandemic, I walked into our downtown office, and, obviously the place wasn't touched for a couple of years, and there's like tons of paper, like literally. And now, and we're only talking like the pandemic was 2020. That's only 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And there's still, invoices with paper on it. And like, and obviously we've transformed because through the pandemic, we figured out how to go and digitalize all these things and use digital as opposed to printing it all out. But I kid you not, there's like this December 2019 folder for invoices. I still see it. Like I walk in and it's literally right there on the filing cabinet, right? And so even in 3 or 4 years, we've come a long way, and I think the pandemic really helped us kind of digitally reinvent and force businesses to do that. Having said that, I still don't think, that we've got a vast majority of that done, right? And there's still opportunity on that. And then I think the other things that excite me is this way of working, and I'm not going to even get into whether you believe philosophically everybody should be in or out, or a remote or whatever. I'm not even going to get into that, but there definitely is a hybrid work environment today of some sort, right? The ability to be kind of create a employee experience that is similar in an office and out of an office drives an incredible amount of technological need and development, and I'm still excited about that because I think we went all in remote, at least for the office, the office crowd, not necessarily the, maybe the manufacturing or different industries, but that crowd went one day all in, we're all in remote, and now we're trying to find our way. But that is going to be a huge trend, I think, restocking how our meeting rooms look and how our conference facilities look, and using the multiple platforms now that have generated through the pandemic on how we're just going to connect virtually. How's somebody going to run a meeting that's got a couple people in an office and a bunch of people remote, wherever they are around the world, whether that's your local workforce or vendors all around the world. So I think there's a huge opportunity on that as well. So that excites me as well. And that's a bit more of a recent challenge as well.
Yeah, I feel a bit targeted because I did print out our security study and I made notes on it, and people were laughing at me. Why did you print that out? I'm like, well, I wanted to have something physical in front of me. I wanted to be able to tactily, handle it and scribble my horrible notes on it. And but yeah, it is surprising. I got back into the office, I wondered how the plants were still alive. That was the big thing for me, is how are our plants still functioning? But no,
Your point on cyber is actually a good one. I mean, I don't know why I missed that. I mean, I don't know that it excites me in the sense that it's all kind of like bad news, right? But I mean,
terrifying.
But yeah, like it's terrifying. Like some of the stuff, like yesterday, my wife got like completely spam bombed, and I didn't even know what that was, by the way. But she's opened her email box, and like it's just flooded. And just emails are coming in,
Yeah.
you know, second after second. You know, you've been signed up for this newsletter and this newsletter, and she's looking at me in the car, and I'm like, oh my god, I don't like, what do I do? And I'm like, I don't even know what that is. So I Google it, and I'm like, oh, that's a spam bomb. I had never even heard of it. And again, that's a pretty low touch, you know, low severe incident. But you started, you know, obviously you've heard many cases, so that excites me in a way that, you know, from an IT, the need of IT. It's going to be a huge thing for us, the industry as in general. It obviously doesn't excite me because it's going to, you know, put businesses at peril and some of those things. But that is a huge space as well.
And I should thank you because in our episode 3 for the podcast, we're actually going to talk about how you know, AI as a tool for you know, the risk, as bad actors using AI for cybersecurity to create risk, but then also, you know, on the flip side, using AI as a tool to prevent risk and cybersecurity incidents and how we respond to those. So thanks for the promo. I appreciate that.
Totally unplanned, right? I had no idea. I didn't even know it was on episode 3. There you go.
But thanks for coming in. So Mihir Shah, our VP and CFO at CDW Canada. I appreciate it, and I appreciate you being part of the podcast.
Thanks, KJ. It was wonderful, wonderful being here. I appreciate the opportunity to help espouse the message of finance and come into finance. We're partners of the business. You know, we're trying to change the profession from, you know, modernize the profession to be collaborators and strategic value drivers of the business, as opposed to a unit of measure of cost. And, you know, we don't buy IT by the pound, right? Like, you know, we're trying to solve problems and digitize and drive business to help achieve outcomes for our companies, right? So thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, and thank you for coming in. I think that, you know, we've talked about a lot of the ways that I think we can work together. And I think that's you know, that's one of the fundamentals of the podcast, I think, is really how do we help IT really integrate with all the other teams and drive that value. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, KJ. Appreciate it.